start, we're going to do some quick introductions. You've already heard my cat story, but my name is Darren Ayers. I'm a senior population health coordinator with Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center, and I do youth substance misuse and suicide prevention work in the Greater Sullivan County region. And then I'm going to bump it over to Andrea and then Carrie to introduce themselves.
Thanks, Darren. Hi, everybody. I'm Andrea Smith, and I'm going to make this easy. I have the exact same role and title as Darren does, but I focus on the Upper Valley region. But I also am a co-facilitator of All Together, which is the Upper Valley's regional substance misuse and suicide prevention coalition. So, Carrie, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Good evening, everybody. My name's Carrie Rochford Haig, and I'm realizing we have to update this slide because I work at the Center for Safer Communities, which used to be Turning Points Network. And we are one of 12 organizations in the state of New Hampshire who provide support to people who've experienced any kind of abuse. And then we also do prevention education. So glad to be here tonight.
Thanks so much, Carrie. Appreciate it. For the rest of you on the call, we won't force you to come off mute and introduce yourself. Because when we're recording, it will just show the speaker view. But we encourage you to put your name, do a quick introduction in the chat. Where are you from? What brings you here today? We'd love to learn more about you. With that, before we really get into any content tonight, we wanted to share our agenda for the evening. So we are going to be going over some New Hampshire trend data around topics of substance use, impaired driving, and then sexual violence. We're then going to transition into information around distracted and impaired driving, share information about some useful tools that you all can use to start conversations around these topics with specific examples and information from SAMHSA's Talk They Hear You campaign. And then we're going to talk about the importance of talking with teens about consent. We're going to be sharing a lot of great information with you, and we will have some time at the end for questions. If you can leave your questions for the allotted time, that is great. But if you have anything urgent, feel free to just come off mute, raise your hand, or do a reaction. We'll also be checking the chat regularly. So if any questions or comments come up, we will address them in the chat or come off mute. Before we get going, just a few objectives that we hope to get out of this session. We want to help you guys understand relevant state YRBS statistics and where to find these reports, understand the data and dangers around distracting and impaired driving, develop tools to keep your teens safe while on the road and at parties, know how to access the Talk They Hear You campaign, like I mentioned, develop different ways to talk to your teen about topics around substance misuse prevention and driving safety, understand what consent is and why it's so important. And then we really hope you leave with the understanding that open communication with your teen around these topics is really one of the best forms of prevention. So we really do this training geared towards anyone, parents, caregivers, school staff, youth serving organizations, really any adult who interacts with youth in their lives, or teens who may be experiencing some big events coming up, graduation, prom, summer parties, birthdays, going off to college, stuff like that. So I'm going to be sharing some information from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, also known as the YRBS. And this survey is conducted nationwide by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which is also the CDC. It goes every 2 years across high schools, and then middle schools can opt in to take it as well if there's funding available. We've had, I think I've had one middle school take it, and it's been really, really helpful. This is an anonymous survey, so youth are able to really answer honestly without fear of anyone else finding out what they answered. And the overall goal of this survey is to really gain a better understanding of things like trends, issues, or additional support needed for the youth population around different topics. And the survey monitors 6 different types of health risk behaviors that really contribute to the leading causes of death and disability among youth and young adults. So That can include behaviors that contribute to unintentional injuries and violence, sexual behaviors that contribute to unintended pregnancy and sexually transmitted diseases, alcohol and other drug use, tobacco use, unhealthy dietary behaviors, and inadequate physical activity. So the data from the YRBS, it's really used extensively by, health departments, schools, and local agencies to define areas of high health risks and to secure the resources necessary to address any identified issues. And with the YRBS taking roughly a year for the results to come in, we can really work quickly as we can analyze the data provided to develop appropriate programs and services that can really positively impact youth and their health. So, some of this can be additional mental health support for youth, increased access to food or education around the dangers of drugs and alcohol. You can find it by just searching New Hampshire YRBS. We're also going to be emailing the links out with the recording, as well as regional stats as well for Greater Sullivan County, which is where I work, and then Upper Valley where Andrea works. For this presentation, I want to note we are still using data from the 2023 YRBS survey. The 2025 survey was administered in most New Hampshire schools in the spring of 2025. It usually has about a year turnaround, so we're hoping that we're going to get the 2025 data at some point. All right. I'm going to start going into data. So this is a lot of numbers. Bear with me. I love data, but I know that it can be very boring at times as well. But again, if you have any questions, feel free to just throw it in the chat. So this table shows information on past 30-day use of substances, including alcohol, marijuana, prescription medication, tobacco, and then electronic vapor products, also known as vapes. And it has trend data from 2019, 2021, and then 2023 to really show, what has changed or what has stayed the same. So as you can see, New Hampshire youth are using alcohol at higher rates, followed by marijuana, vapes, and then prescription medication is the least used substance by youth. In New Hampshire, nearly 1 in 4 youth reported currently drinking alcohol, while 1 in 5 reported using marijuana. And youth vaping rates seem to be decreasing, which is really great to see. And we are working hard to support schools and youth looking to quit vaping. Our team just helped put out some youth PSAs this week. So if you're in the Upper Valley or Sullivan County region, you are going to hear a lot of ads, or not ads, PSAs from our youth to really talk about it and debunk some myths, which has been really cool. I would also like to mention that while looking at this data, it's really important to understand that the majority of youth are not using substances. 77% of New Hampshire youth reported that they don't drink, 80% don't use marijuana, 83% don't vape, and then 95% of youth don't use prescription medication. And I really want to emphasize this because it's important that we really break the stigma to the youth in our lives that, all kids do it, because in fact, the majority of kids are not using substances. And knowing that might help teens say no to peer pressure if anyone asks them to use substances with them. This slide goes over ease of access for alcohol, marijuana, and prescription medication, which basically asks students, do you think it would be very easy to get alcohol, marijuana, or prescription drugs? And in 2023, 29% of youth felt it would be very easy to get alcohol, 27% thought it would be easy to get marijuana, and then 6% thought it would be easy to get a prescription medication. So following trends, it looks like youth are not finding it as easy to get these substances compared to years past, with a larger dip in 2021, which is most likely due to social isolation during the pandemic. But now that, kids are back in school, people are socializing a bit more, we're really eager to see that 2025 data to see if anything changed. We're also seeing the last, Andrea, 6 months to a year, youth are reporting getting vape devices off the internet. So that's something that we are really trying to navigate a lot more because you previously couldn't do that. So we're going to be interested to see if there will be any changes to data with that. Carrie will be going over some information around consent later on in this presentation, and part of the reason that she's here is because of the data collected around sexual violence. In New Hampshire, 10% or 1 in 10 youth reported being physically forced to have sexual intercourse when they did not want it. That is a really scary number for us to see, which is really why we think it's so important to share how impactful it can be when adults talk to youth about the importance of consent, how to say no, what no really means, and how to respect your own and other people's boundaries. And then our last data slide goes over information around impaired driving. When it comes to impaired driving, 47% of New Hampshire youth have reported texting or emailing while driving. 4% drove while they had been drinking alcohol, and 16% drove in a vehicle driven by someone who has been drinking alcohol. So if you're anything like me, you will think those impaired driving stats are really scary. And I think that oftentimes people just don't simply understand what impaired driving is. So I'm going to get into that a little bit. So according to the CDC, impaired driving happens when someone operates a vehicle while impaired by a substance like marijuana, other illicit drugs, some prescribed over-the-counter medicines, or alcohol. And impairment continues to be the leading cause of motor vehicle crashes. In recent years, almost 40% of all crashes in New Hampshire involved an impaired driver. Driving while impaired by any substance can really be deadly, and about 1 in 14 car crashes involved an underage driver who had been drinking. And then marijuana users were about 25% more likely to be involved in a car crash than drivers with no evidence of marijuana use. This slide here, there's a lot going on. So again, we're gonna send the slides out, but I wanted to just mention that impaired drivers can really have serious consequences, obviously including injury or death. You'll see a description of these effects for different blood alcohol concentration levels on this left picture on the slide. But in New Hampshire, the legal BAC limit for drivers over 21 is 0.08%. For drivers under 21, which as we already know is illegal, the BAC limit is 0.02%. So generally, any concentration over 0.16% is greater is considered an aggravated DWI. So just in this example, if somebody has a BAC of 0.05, the type of effects are exaggerating behavior. They may have loss of small muscle control, like focusing your eyes. They may have impaired judgment, or they may get that like feel-good feeling. And the predictable effects on driving will include, things like reduced coordination, reduced ability to track moving objects, difficulty steering, reduced response to emergency driving situations, stuff like that. And then you will also see that the chart shows the different substances and how they can stay in your system, or how long they can stay in the system. So it's difficult to give a precise number of drinks that will result in a 0.08 BAC, because it really depends on individual factors like gender, weight, metabolism, the speed at which alcohol is consumed. However, just as a general guideline, for an average 180-pound male, it can take 4 to 5 drinks to reach 0.08, and remain in someone's system for up to 8 days, which is also important, 7 days. And then in addition to the effects that impairment has on our body, there also can really affect you or your teen's wallet, daily schedule, and insurance cost. A DWI can cost a minimum of $10,000. And that's a minimum cost because that does not include things like lawyer fees, vehicle towing fees, and other violation fees that may come up. And you'll also have to pay for a breathalyzer to be installed and removed in all of your vehicles. There's also under the New Hampshire Ignition Interlock Device Law, which is also known as the New Hampshire IID. A driver must install a device like the one in the picture on this screen in every single vehicle that they use on a regular basis. So for some people, this means having multiple devices if they drive more than one vehicle. And that device must stay in their vehicle for 1 to 2 years. The initial installation fee can be between $70 to $100, and then can have monthly fees anywhere from $60 to $90. And then there's also a fee to get it removed as well. I also want to mention, lastly, your insurance payment will go up a substantial amount. And with all this information being brought to your attention, it's just really important to let your teens know that impaired driving is just entirely preventable by the actions and decisions they choose to make. And we're going to go over a little bit of tips and tricks that you can help have conversations with them. We know that it can be really difficult to have these conversations with teens. So these are just some tips from the New Hampshire State Police that you can share with any teens that you interact with. So the first one, have them plan a safe ride home. We know some of the teens may have older friends who may be legal age to drink, but remind them that it's never safe to get in a vehicle with someone who has been drinking. Allow them to know, like, you are always a call away to give them a safe ride home. And then if your teen knows someone who has been drinking or using substances, really encourage them not to let that person get behind the wheel. Have them take the keys from the friend, and then they can help arrange for a sober ride home. And then anytime you or your teen gets in a vehicle, please always put your seatbelt on. It's the best defense while on the road. We just kind of went over impaired driving. So now we're going to go into distracted driving, which some of us might assume we already know what it means, but sometimes a reminder is helpful. I know a reminder for myself can be helpful too. So we all maybe could do a little bit of work on this one. But distracted driving is any activity that diverts attention from driving. So there's really three main types of distracted driving. The first is visual. So that's taking your eyes off the road. The second is manual, taking your hands off the road. And then the third is cognitive, taking your mind off of driving. So actually, texting and driving uses all three types of those distracting driving. Texting is the most alarming distraction because when sending or reading a text message, it takes your eyes off the road for about 5 seconds on average. So if you're driving 55 miles per hour on the highway, that's basically driving the length of an entire football field with your eyes closed. That's definitely a stat that opens my eyes a little bit more. No pun intended on that one. And then reaching for something in your car increases your chance of collision by 9 times. Teens who text while driving spend 10% of their driving time outside of their lane, which is just such a crazy stat to hear about. And then, as I'm sure we all know, in the state of New Hampshire in 2015, we put in effect the hands-free electronic device law. And this law really prohibits the use of electronic devices while driving or temporarily halted in traffic or like at a stop sign or stuff like that. And penalties for violating this law is $100 for the first offense, $250 for the second, and then $500 for the third offense. It is also possible to have your license suspended, or you could lose it completely depending on how many offenses you have had. And then it's just really important that your teen is reminded of this, hands-free and the dangers of distracted driving. So we want to just continue to have conversations about safe driving and finding a method that works for them to, have their phone away while driving, because it's just important that we're getting to our destinations safely. And then my last slide before I'm going to pass it off is just some tips and tricks that we can keep in mind. Really get involved and stay involved with your teen driver is the most important thing that we want you to take away from this segment right here. So the first thing as a tip, be a good role model. Remember that your teen is looking to you as a new driver. So practice safe driving yourself. Set aside time daily to spend time with your teen on the road to continue practicing safe driving skills. And then enforce strict penalties. Have rules set in place before you hand the keys off to your teen. If they break those rules, let them know there's going to be consequences for that rules that's broken. Ultimately, if your teen does not drive impaired or distracted, there could be serious consequences if they do it. So having some ground rules could really help avoid those more severe consequences. Check your car out. Always make sure that the car your teen is driving is safe and in is good condition. Make sure your teen is prepared by having emergency kits in your car. Some examples of this could be first aid kit, flashlight, jumper cables, because this is something that could be really helpful in a time of need. And then I just want to mention, continue to talk to your teen about the importance of driving safely and being aware of other drivers on the road. So I just went over a bunch of current trends, how to keep your teen safe when it comes to driving. And I'm going to pass it over to Andrea, who will really go over more tips and tricks on how you can support teens in their life.
Thank you, Darren. All right, so before we get into tips for keeping your teen safe around those milestone events, let's think a little bit about why a teen might start to drink or use other substances. So we know factors like stress, peer pressure, transitions, those are things that might increase the risk of your child using alcohol or other substances. But we also want to keep in mind that kids can be influenced by watching what the adults in their life are doing as well. So I really encourage you to think about how you cope with stress, with peer pressure, or life transitions. So let's continue to think about these life transitions or these big milestones in a teen's life. So depending on your teen, things like maybe ending a senior athletic season, going to prom and graduating, those are probably some of the more significant events that we associate, going to parties or partying with. So just right off the bat, one resource that I want to share is healthychildren.org. That's a great resource for all things really children from like newborn all the way up to 18. And they have some really great tips and things to keep in mind if your teen is going to go to a party. So that's where I'm getting some of these things from. So communication and honesty, like those are important. Those are so important to keeping your teens safe. So we know that teens whose parents talk with them regularly about substances, marijuana, alcohol, vaping, they are 42% less likely to use substances than those whose parents don't. So it's really important that we tell our teens that we expect them not to use alcohol or other substances at parties. So some tips if your teen is going to go to a party. Know where your teen is going and how long they're going to be there. So have the phone number and the address of the party. Make an agreement that your teen will call you if the location of the party changes, and be sure to let your teen know where you will be during that party. Another tip is to call the parent or the caregiver of the party host to make sure that someone, an adult, will be home the entire time and will also be supervising the party. We want to make sure also by calling that party host that there's not going to be any alcohol, marijuana, other substances, that those are not going to be allowed. We want to talk with our teens beforehand about how to handle a situation where alcohol or other substances might be available at a party. So it's really important that we practice ways or encourage our teen, help our teens to practice ways to turn down when alcohol or other substances are offered. We don't want their very first time saying no to something to be when they're right there in that moment where peer pressure is going to be the strongest. They might be embarrassed. So we really want to, have those practices beforehand. We want to make sure that our teens have a way to get to and from the party. So make it easy for them to leave a party by making it clear that they can call you at any time for a ride home. Have these conversations and discuss why they might need to make such a call, and remind them to never ride home with somebody who has been drinking or using other substances. I've had people tell me that they and their children have come up with a code word or a phrase for their teen to use with their parent or caregiver that signals that they're not comfortable and they just want to leave without making it obvious to their friends. And then when the parent or caregiver shows up and they get in the car, they leave it at that. The parents aren't grilling them about, well, what was there? What made you uncomfortable? Who brought what? Who, anything like that. It just was a simple kind of mutual respect. Like my teen said, I don't want to be here anymore. And you went and picked them up, and that was that. So I've had a lot of people say that that's worked really well for them. Another thing is to try, if you are not an early, kind of an early go to bed person, but to try to be up to greet your teen when they come home. This can be a really good way to just check the time, talk about the evening, see how your teen is doing. And then if your teen is staying overnight at a friend's house after the party, verifying that arrangement with that person's parents or caregivers, making sure that they will be home as well. So those are some tips if your teen is going to a party. Now, if you are the one that's going to be hosting the celebration or the party at your house, here are some tips and tricks here. We want to plan in advance. Darren, if you want to go ahead to the next slide, please. Thank you. We want to plan in advance. So go over the party plans with your teen and encourage them to plan non-alcohol related group activities or games. We want to make sure that we're keeping the party small. So, when a teen plans a party, news can spread very quickly via social media, Snapchat, things like that. And parties can grow too large for parents to really control. So we want to make sure at least one adult is present at all times, and you can ask other parents to come over to help you, if you need it, or to hang out with you guys. We want to set a guest list. So the party, make it known that the party is for people that were invited only. So no quote, party crashers allowed. And this will really help to avoid the open party situation, and also making sure that people aren't kind of coming and going. Another tip is, excuse me, is to start the ending times, or excuse me, set starting and ending times for the party. So, be aware of any local curfew laws or anything like that that you have in your location, and use that to help determine an ending time. And then we want to set party rules and your expectations. So discuss with your teen before the party what those rules and expectations are going to look like. Some examples of the rules could include, the obvious of no substances. So no tobacco, alcohol, other substances. No one can leave the party and then return. If you're going to be at the party, you have to stay at the party. And when you leave, you're done. You're not coming back to the party. Maybe something like lights are left on at all times, or certain rooms of the house are off limits. We also want to make sure that we have plenty of food and non-alcoholic beverages available. And then we want to be making sure that we're putting our alcohol or any other prescription medications or over-the-counter medications. We want to make sure all of those are locked up and out of reach for maybe teens that maybe go wandering and enter a room that was, marked as off limits. And then the final one is, be there but not square. So, pick a spot where you can sort of see what's going on without being in the way. That doesn't mean that like you're in the room at all times, but make sure that the kids know, the teens know, they are aware of your presence, that they know you're there, they know that you're paying attention, and that it's not just like free range, they can do whatever they want. So all of these tips can help make sure that you're set up for a safe celebration. But there are some things that we need to know when it comes to hosting teen parties. And that is the social host liability. So, parent networking or parent caregiver networking is really the best prevention tool to combat underage drinking. So, getting to know your teen's friends and their parents is really going to help. So, if your teen is planning on going to a party, again, like I had mentioned, call those parents or caregivers to ensure that they're going to be home and that they, again, have that same rule of not allowing substances to be present. If this isn't possible, if you don't have the number, if they kind of gave you responses that you didn't like, you set the rules. Don't let your teen go to that. I know it may not be, it's easier said than done, but you can kind of set that standard going forward. And it's important to know that parents and caregivers, we are legally responsible for anything that happens to a minor who's been served alcohol or other substances in their home. So if anyone brings alcohol or other substances at your house, be prepared to contact their parents or caregivers. If somebody comes to your home and they're already intoxicated, we want to make sure that they're getting home safely. So, it's important to include your teen in that. Help them feel responsible for this as well, because then it's really probably going to decrease the likelihood that someone's going to come to the house already intoxicated, or be intoxicated. And so with the social host liability, it's really important that parents understand that they may be criminally or civilly liable if alcohol is provided at a party that they have organized. If someone's property is damaged, if somebody gets injured, if someone leaves and then gets into a car accident and, injures someone else, or if, the worst possible thing, if somebody dies from that. So it's really important to understand the local laws around alcohol and other substances when hosting a party. And so laws and alcohol and substance use, it varies from state to state. So just make sure you know what those are. In New Hampshire and Vermont, there's a $2,000 fine in addition to potential jail time. So of course, that's just going to really be based on sort of what happened, so providing alcohol to a minor is going to have that $2,000 fine, and then probably a much less severe other consequence versus if somebody gets injured or gets into a car accident after being served alcohol at your house. So this next slide is just, this is kind of the start of, the big information. So the one thing I want to point out, there's a stat, again, as Darren mentioned, this is 2023 data from the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, but we really look at perception of harm, and we want to make sure that that's kind of trending to where perception of harm is increasing. So while I don't have the trend data on here, but you can see for alcohol, youth who thought their parents believed that it was wrong or very wrong to use the following substances, you can see that 86% of youth thought that their parents felt it would be wrong or very wrong. So we, as years go on, we always want to see that number climbing. We want to see it, increasing, ideally to 100%, but that may not happen. So while it's never too late to have conversations with your child about alcohol or other substances, it's also never too early to start these conversations. So ideally, the best time to start talking with your child about alcohol and other drugs is before they are exposed to it. However, it's never too late to start that. So if you approach those conversations directly, and honestly, your child is more likely to respect your rules and advice about alcohol and other substance use. And so another, one of the bigger takeaways from this is that lots of little talks keeps those lines of communication open and work better than having one big talk. So instead of sitting down and trying to talk to your teen for, an hour about all of this stuff, it's important that we do just little talks frequently over time. I think that youth will kind of absorb and digest that information better rather than that big talk. And then be direct and honest in our conversation. So although it may not seem like it, research does show us that young people really do listen to what their parents have to say about alcohol and other substance use. Excuse me. Let me just, oh, sorry, I lost track of where I was. Okay, so there is a campaign or a tool out there to help you have these conversations. So SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, launched a campaign in 2013 called Talk They Hear You. So this is a national media campaign that really provides parents and caregivers different tools and resources to help you have conversations with your kids early and often to prevent underage drinking and other substance use. So some of the goals of this campaign are to help parents or caregivers get informed, be prepared, and take action, really are centered around having these conversations. So I want to look at just a couple of the resources from this campaign. So this next slide shows us that one of the most important factors in a healthy child development is that strong, open relationship with their parent. So it's important to start talking with your children about these drugs, like I had mentioned, before they are exposed to them, maybe as early as 9 years old. So this Talk They Hear You campaign, they have these 5 conversation goals to help you sort of get started, but to remember, to keep these conversations low key. Again, we don't want to fit everything in one talk. So plan to check in often with these quick chats and keep these lines of communication open. So for conversation goal number one, we want to show that we disapprove of underage drinking and other use. So make it clear, send that clear, strong message that you disapprove of this. For conversation goal number two, we want to show that we care about our children's kind of well-being, their wellness, their success. That really seems obvious, but again, youth are more likely to listen when they know you're on their side. So remind them why you don't want them drinking or using other substances. It's because we want them to be happy and safe. So these conversations will go a lot better if you're open and show your concern for their well-being. And so for conversation goal number three, we want our kids to be making informed decisions about alcohol and other substances with reliable information about the risks and dangers. So you don't want them learning about alcohol or other substances from bad sources of information. So make sure they know you are the trustworthy source of information. And conversation goal number four, we know young people are more likely to drink alcohol or use other substances if they think that no one's going to notice. So show that you're aware of what your child's up to, but we want to do it in a subtle way. Try not to pry. If you ask, if you're asking about like your friends and the plans, it's because you care, not because you're judging. They're more likely to talk with you openly. And then number five, even if you don't think your children want to drink or, use alcohol or try other drugs, pressure from their friends can make it hard for them to say no. So having a plan to avoid underage drinking and other substance use can help them make these better choices. So like I had mentioned before, talk with your kids about what they would do if they were faced with a decision about alcohol and other substances and really practice with them that no thanks, in that safe environment and keep it low key. All right, so on this next slide, this is another one of, I'm not going to go through all of these just for the sake of time, but this is just another tool is, when we're having these conversations, like kids can have some tough questions that we may not like, I don't know how to answer that. If they ask me if I drank and maybe used marijuana when I was younger, how am I going to answer that? And so this resource really gives you some good ideas of how you can answer those questions. I just want to see if there's one that I want to point out. Um, yeah, so what if my friends ask me to drink or use drugs? Again, helping them say no to peer pressure. I've kind of uh, talked that one up pretty much. I think you get the point with that one. So we can go to that next slide here. Um, so there's two other resources within this Talk They Hear You campaign. And the first is this mobile app. So it's available to download for free. And it's really great because you can go through these practice scenarios with conversation starters, what the goals are, possible reactions and closers with, other helpful information. There's a recording feature so you can do this practice conversation. Then you can play it back for yourself to hear how you would sound talking to your teen. And then there's a self-assessment that lets you rate yourself on how well you achieved kind of that conversation goal that you're working on. And then the next one is just the Screen for Success tool. So this is a 10-minute screener that will look for signs of elevated risk. If you want to go ahead to the next slide, please. Elevated risk, and it will help you find support to address their needs. And there's a resources section that will provide you with recommended support services, which is really great. And so on the next slide, we have frequent conversations with your child about alcohol and other substances. We know that that keeps the lines of communications open. So it's kind of one of those like, congratulations, you've had the first talk. But I really want you and I encourage you, Darren, if you can go to the next slide, to consider how would you talk to your 9-year-old versus your 15-year-old versus your 20-year-old about these issues. They're all at different points in their lives, and they're all going to be dealing with or facing different types of peer pressure, different types of life transitions. So, it's important to make sure that the conversation changes as your kids grow up as well. And then I think it's my last slide maybe is just one final resource. just quickly to show you is we developed a series of short videos for parents and caregivers to use as a tool while navigating kind of the tough issues of raising, raising teens. So it covers a variety of perspectives. You'll hear from, one mom's story of how she navigated her child having a substance use disorder, and what that was like as a parent. We talk about Valley Court diversion as an alternative resource within our communities. We talk to Dr. Budney, who brings a scientific perspective to cannabis. We have a former high school graduate that brings sort of that youth voice and so on. So this playlist lives on our Altogether YouTube channel. So if you scan that QR code, again, you'll get a copy of these slides. So don't worry about, doing it right now. But if you scan that QR code, you'll have access to that entire playlist. And then really, like Darren talked about at the end of her section, you're going to find a consistent theme throughout all of those videos and throughout everything that I just talked about, which, spoiler, it is talking to your kids. That is the most important thing to, help them be prepared when they are navigating these life transitions, when they are celebrating, to help them celebrate safely and to, make the good decisions to say no to using alcohol and other substances. And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Carrie, and she's going to talk a little bit about talking with teens about consent, especially around kind of that prom graduation season. And yeah, so Carrie, go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Um, I just want to say a couple of things before we jump into the slides. I appreciated how Andrea said it's little talks often, because that is true as we're talking about consent too. I think as our kids get older and we think about some of the conversations getting more complicated, it can feel like I've got to get ready for the big talk. But the great thing is all of what we've been talking about here, these are foundational blocks that you're building with your young people so that as the conversations get more complicated, you've got something to draw on. So I would encourage you to really kind of take that tonight as as a takeaway. Little talks often. Don't wait for that one big conversation. And I appreciated Darren saying it's open communication, right? That's a protective factor for our young people when we as adults can really nurture that open conversation with them. And Andrea, I don't know if you saw in the chat, Kelly put in about yeah, right. Her daughter being able to really kind of resist some, perhaps even indirect peer pressure, but a friend choosing to do something that was risky and her daughter choosing to leave that situation. So it's good for us to have a chance as adults to talk about this and to know that these conversations with our kids really do make a difference and help them help to promote healthy decision making. So I also wanted to say that April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. And so it's really, I appreciate this opportunity to be here and talk with you all tonight about consent, because the good news is that sexual assault is 100% preventable, right? And that statistic, right, that YRBS statistic about 1 in 10 teens in New Hampshire being forced into sexual activity, by doing what we're doing here tonight, by helping adults have the information and kind of build their skills to talk with their young people, we can change those numbers. So I really appreciate people taking the time to be here tonight and talk with us about this. Okay, so let's jump right in. So, on that same theme of little talks often, start young, as we have mentioned, look for everyday ways to talk about consent. We're kind of here tonight thinking about teens and thinking about consent as it might relate to teens in relationships or sexual relationships. But what we find the most effective is when we can talk with kids about consent long before it has anything to do with sexual activity. So things like borrowing things, right? Going into someone's personal space, tickling, wrestling, play fighting, those kinds of things where we have an opportunity to model for young people and talk with them about how we don't touch people without asking for permission, right? Sometimes people like touch, sometimes they don't like touch. And so it's really important to ask for permission before we touch people. And when we can do that when they're young in these situations, then again, as they get older, and we are talking about situations involving relationships, dating relationships, sexual relationships, they've already got this, right? They've already learned this skill about, oh yeah, that's right. We don't touch people without asking, and we don't touch people who say no or stop. Okay. Um, and consent is really about asking for permission, right? That is a big part of it. So the more we can talk with young people about that when they're young, we can help to really set that firm foundation. Things like going into a sibling's bedroom, opening up the bathroom door, right? That we knock before we enter, right? We're kind of also modeling this idea that, right, people have a right to privacy and they're to have their privacy respected. So that really goes hand in hand as we're talking about consent. All right, so the next slide is going to talk about boundaries. Right, boundaries are consent is about boundaries. And we as adults can think about ways that that we're modeling boundaries, that we're aware of boundaries in our own lives, and also when we're aware of our boundaries being crossed or where our boundaries are being challenged. Right, we want to help give young people the language to talk about boundaries and what is okay and feels okay and is not okay, but they're not going to be able to do that unless they have it modeled for them, unless they learn some of that language. So there are lots of things that we set boundaries about every day, right? And you can see the list that's here, right? And the people that we're setting boundaries with, that happens in many different ways, right? In our homes, in our workplaces, right? With our friends, any kinds of groups that we're connected with, right? We're all the time, we are navigating boundaries. And the great thing is that when we help teach young people about boundaries, about being able to recognize them and set them and respect them, we are helping to give them the skills for healthy relationships, not just sexual relationships, but all relationships. One of the things that we talk with young people about, I didn't mention, but our organization, in addition to providing support to people who've experienced any kind of abuse, we do a lot of work in the schools helping to teach young people healthy relationship skills, such as recognizing boundaries, respecting boundaries, empathy, consent. And so it really, one of the things that we find helpful to talk with them about is if you're not sure about a boundary, check in, right? So we'll often talk about look, listen, and check in. So you're paying attention to what's going on around you. You're using that social awareness to see, hey, how am I doing respecting someone else's boundaries? You're listening to things like maybe a change in tone of voice. Maybe that joke that you thought was really funny, it didn't land well, right? A friend looks uncomfortable, or you can just kind of tell that the vibe has changed, right? That social awareness skill, which is a social emotional skill, is a really important one for consent as well. And then checking in if you're not sure, like, hey, I didn't mean to offend you. Are you okay? That's a great way to model recognizing and respecting boundaries. All right, our next slide is going to go over one of our favorite graphics as we talk with young people, and that is that consent is like fries. And we love this graphic for lots of reasons. One, because, French fries just tend to make people smile and make them happy. And so what we want to do is associate these conversations about consent with something that can seem fun, right, and lighthearted. And that is, if you take each of the letters, they stand for something that's important as we're thinking about consent. So it's freely given. Freely given meaning it's not manipulated, it's not pressured, it's not taking advantage of someone who's under the influence, but consent is something that's freely given. It's reversible, meaning people can change their mind. They can decide they want to do something and then they can say, no, I don't want to do that. And we talk with young people about how you never lose the right to say no, right? Even if you said yes, you can change your mind. We talk about it being informed. So this is where the alcohol and other substances can really come into play, because if someone's under the influence, they can't make an informed decision, right? And I appreciate this as an educator, where sometimes people can get really keyed in on like the legal boundaries about consent, and those are important. But I love this because what it's really saying is that when someone's brain is under the influence of substances, they can't make an informed decision. And so that makes mixing sexual relationships and alcohol and other substances risky, because you may not know, you aren't going to know that you really have that informed consent. The E stands for enthusiastic, right? So again, it's not a hesitancy. It's not someone seeming unsure. It's not that saying okay, but the body language doesn't match that, right? That wouldn't meet our definition of consent. Enthusiastic is just like it sounds. There's no doubt that both people are freely saying this is something they want to participate in. And then the last one is specific, meaning that every action, every time. So because someone made out, yesterday, that doesn't mean they want to make out today, right? Because someone made out, that doesn't mean they want to go further sexually, right? That consent is something that needs to be asked and received each time with each action. One thing I would encourage you to think about is, and I loved when you were talking about like just having these everyday conversations. I find the car is a really good place for these. So where you can kind of not have to be looking eye contact, but you can be having some of these conversations. Pay attention to the music that your kids are listening to and the shows that they're watching and streaming and what are the influencers that they're paying attention to, because sometimes there can be messages in there that would be counter to some of this. And it can be an opportunity to talk about like, whoa, wow, I'd never really listened to that lyric before. What does that mean to you? And use it as an opportunity to talk with them. Okay, our next slide is going to talk about why consent conversations matter. So again, that statistic that we talked about, 1 in 10 youth in New Hampshire. The other thing I would mention to you is that nationally, 1 out of 10 children experience some kind of sexual abuse before the age of 18. And in 1/3 to 1/2 of those cases, it's the harmful sexual behavior of another young person. So it really kind of goes against what maybe we have been taught about, like we need to teach our kids how to be safe around strangers. Really, what we want to teach our kids is healthy relationship skills and consent skills around everyone. They're more likely to be hurt by someone they know and trust than by a stranger. That doesn't mean we don't want to teach our kids about how to be safe around strangers, but we want to definitely make sure we're including these conversations about healthy relationships, what to do if you feel uncomfortable, or if you're faced with a situation with a friend where someone is not feeling safe. Do you know how to talk to an adult that you trust about that? Girls and young women ages 16 to 24 experience the highest rates of intimate partner violence. For those of you who have teens in your lives who are, getting close to graduation or maybe, going off to college, the statistics are pretty bleak about college and sexual assault. It's 1 in 5 women and 1 in 16 men experience sexual assault while in college. So again, we don't want to wait until they're getting ready to go off to college to talk about this. Although I always say to people, it's never too late. So depending on who you are tonight listening to this, and you might be thinking, oh my gosh, I should have started these conversations 3 years ago. That's okay. You're not alone. All of us as parents have had those moments where we're like, oh, I wish I could rewind and do that a little differently. And we want you to know it's not ever too late to begin these conversations and talk with your young people. The next slide just reinforces some of what we said with the fries. So I'm not going to go over all of that, but we talk a lot about empathy-based consent. And what that means is that consent is more than just a box to check. It used to be that we would say no means no, right? And then we realized in the best practices with prevention that that actually doesn't land well. And it doesn't really do justice to the fact that sometimes consent can be complicated. And I think sometimes as adults, we oversimplify and we like say, hey, no means no. But we don't help kids to know, well, what about when the yes seems unsure? What do you do with that? Is that a yes or a no? Or what do you do with a maybe? Right? So understanding that really that true empathy, true consent is based on empathy. It's being able to look at that other person and know that, they're looking out for someone's best interest. They're not taking advantage of someone. They're treating that person with respect. They're giving that person autonomy over their body. And that is so much more than just no means no, right? Something was said in a training recently that I loved, and they said if someone doesn't have the ability to say no, they don't really have the ability to say yes. So part of our work as adults too is helping our young people accept no, right? And what to do when maybe they want to do something with a dating partner and that partner doesn't want to do that. How do they cope with that emotion of, I'm disappointed because I thought that they would want to do this, or I'm disappointed because all my friends say that they're doing this. And so, right, we need to help our young people be able to cope with the fact that their wants and needs and might not match up with someone else's. And statistically, we know that more than half of high school students are not engaging in sex. But the media and peer pressure piece around that often says a very different story. So again, have these conversations with them. Let them know that it's you're there to help them navigate some of this with the questions that they might have about consent. And then I know we're getting close on time, so I want to just in this next one mention a couple of things to you about the legal boundary. So when we're talking about the role of alcohol and other substances, a couple of things to keep in mind here, right? 70 to 80% of college sexual assaults involve alcohol. Okay, so we know that alcohol does not and other drugs do not cause sexual assault, but what they can do is make reading boundaries, respecting boundaries, the ability to know to make responsible decisions. Those things are all affected when the brain is under the influence of alcohol or other drugs. So we want to talk to our young people about that and say it's a dangerous mix because you can't be sure that you're getting consent. The age of consent in New Hampshire is 16. That's the age that someone has the ability to give consent. Okay. This is not intended to be legal advice. We want to be really clear about that. Sometimes people have very specific questions about the laws, and we would encourage you to reach out to local law enforcement or even to an attorney if you have specific legal questions. But we want to give you some of the parameters around some things that you could talk about as it relates to healthy decision making and thinking about potential legal consequences. New Hampshire, you may have heard some states have a Romeo and Juliet law. New Hampshire doesn't have a Romeo and Juliet law, but what it has is what's called a close in age exemption. And so what that means is depending on the ages of the young people and depending on the sexual contact, there may or may not be legal charges. Couple of things that are important to remember about that. It can really depend on the adults involved. Okay, so even though New Hampshire has this close in age exemption, which is saying that basically 13 to 15-year-olds can consent to sexual activity, but not penetration, as long as their partner's age is within 4 years of their own. But the important thing to remember about that is that if an adult of one of those young people feels that there was any kind of pressure or manipulation or coercion, there could be charges brought, even if they are close in age. So, a lot of times teens want us to be able to give them that black and white answer as to like, what does the law say? This is one of those areas where it can depend on a lot of factors. It can depend on local law enforcement. It can depend on the county attorney and how they perceive these cases and how they are prosecuting these cases. So the good news is by the prevention work that we're doing, we can hopefully avoid legal consequences, right, for everyone, because we're teaching people how to be able to respect boundaries. And I love one of the things that I love that was shared at another training. They talked about, knowing that if someone was under the influence, do they feel like the partner, the person that they're with, would have their back, would be looking out for them, would know about respecting their boundaries, and that if someone is using alcohol or other drugs to try to get a partner to do something sexually that they wouldn't do if they were not under the influence, right? That's not a healthy relationship. So just some good things to kind of keep in mind as we're thinking about talking with our teens. And I did want to mention to you the last slide, there are programs like the Center for Safer Communities. Oh, we can skip that one just for time. But there are programs like the Center for Safer Communities throughout New Hampshire. So depending on where you live, there may be another program that covers your community. You can always contact us and we will help to steer you to the organization that covers your local community. And we also provide support to people who've experienced sexual assault. So if you know someone that has experienced sexual assault or sexual abuse and they are looking for support, there's 24-hour crisis and support available through all of these programs throughout New Hampshire. So I think at this point, I'm gonna turn it back over to Darren and we'll wrap up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carrie, and Andrea, for just adding your insight to this presentation. It was really appreciated. Just really quickly, I'm not going to go through this slide, but this slide here has some further resources. Again, we're going to send the slideshow. Yeah, wow. We're going to send this out afterwards, so you'll have these links handy. And we will also send out, Andrea and I created an online resource library that has like all you can eat varieties of resources around substance misuse and all this stuff. So we will send that in the email as well. And with that,